Well, if you're new with us or you haven't been here in a minute, we have been in this series called Wired for Joy. And as we get started, let me just apologize if my voice cracks at all this morning while I talk, okay? I want to promise you that I'm not going through puberty, I'm pretty sure, in my mid-40s. But I did go to the Denver Nuggets opening basketball game last night. Let's go, a victory. And we all know that when we cheer, they play better. So it was my moral duty to help them to their victory last night. So if my voice cracks, forgive me. I was not a good pastor. I was not thinking about this morning. With that in mind, if you're new with us, one of the things I will often say is I have three great loves in life: Jesus, my family, and the NBA. I've grown up loving the NBA. And when I moved out of Nebraska. I'd rooted for the Chicago Bulls as I grew up and Michael Jordan, and I moved to Ohio. And once I got to Ohio, I was actually in a state that had a professional basketball team, the Cleveland Cavaliers. And so I naturally started rooting for them. I'm like, well, I'm in the state, I can root for them. And at the time, when I first moved there was this high schooler who was becoming famous, and his name was LeBron James. And I began to learn about him in Ohio. They talked about him all the time, and so I would see clips of him. I went to watch him in high school at the Shot and Scene Center in downtown Columbus, Ohio. I was like, man, this kid is going to be something special. And of course, he got drafted by the Cavaliers. And in the process of all that, I met my wife, who, although first few years of her life was in Puerto Rico, she grew up most of her life west of Cleveland and was a massive Cleveland Cavaliers fan. And so, of course, when the Cavaliers drafted LeBron James #1, she was over the moon and pumped. I often joke that the way God showed me that we were to be married is on date one. She told me two things. She told me that she watched SportsCenter twice a day and that she loved the NBA. And I was like, this is over, this is done. Date number 2 is guaranteed, and it's going to be happily ever after from here on. And that's what it's been, right? Up and to the right. And so we have a natural love affair for the NBA and for LeBron James. So we followed his career for the last 20 years. And when we moved to Denver 9 years ago, we're like, well, we probably won't we won't hear all that talk all that much. But we had a chance to go to a Nuggets game where LeBron was coming and he was playing. And we got to talking about how cool it would be to get near to LeBron James. And it just so happens in the life of our church, actually, they were here first service. Some dear friends, John and Lynn, they're some of the head ushers at Denver Nuggets games. So they're great people to get to know when you go to games, all right? It's not about what you know, who you know. And so we went with them to try to hatch a plan, like, what are the odds that even though we have to take an oxygen tank to our seats, we might be able to get down low, and like, how close could you get us to LeBron James? That was the question. And they started talking about it. They're like, we think we can get you really close. And so they devised a plan, like show up at this time and come to this thing and sneak around this usher and then get down to us. And sure enough, that's what we did. Now, it was going to be too obvious if I went, because I'm a tall white guy and I look like I'm middle-aged. But Cynthia, on the other hand, Puerto Ricans age really well, and she can pass for a 16-year-old sometimes. So what John did, John's responsibility was to keep all the fans off of the tunnel so they stay away from the players. But what he did is he had Cynthia sneak down, and she went behind his back, and he just stood there like he was supposed to and acted like she was a teenager, because he can let kids be on the tunnel. And so sure enough, she got to be on the tunnel that LeBron James ran in and out of, and here's how close she got to LeBron James. Picture. There we go. Hand sticking out. If he would have chosen to give the high five. That's how close she got to the presence of LeBron James. She didn't, I promise you, we went up to our seats, we went back up to the nosebleed. She didn't care about what happened the rest of the game. She was a giddy little schoolgirl because she was closer to LeBron than she ever dreamed she could be. Now, for the past few weeks in this series, we've been making the case that the pursuit of joy is actually found in a place. It's found in a location. It's actually found in a person. The person of Jesus. We start with the where, not the how. When you're looking for the abundant life that Jesus offers, that Jesus talks about, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full, that they may have abundant life, the question should start with where do our eyes go? And our eyes, he says, go to him. It's a place that we find joy. Now, what I want to do today is, I'm assuming that most of you are buying that. Now listen, I know every week that we gather, there's some people who you're exploring faith and you're not sure where you're at with your faith. And I just want to say we're so grateful that you're here, that you found this to be a safe place, that you're exploring the person of Jesus. And so we're so grateful that you're here. Keep exploring. We're going to keep making room for you to do that. I don't assume that you may agree with what I'm saying right now, but for the rest of you who go, okay, I'm buying the premise of joy is found in the person of Jesus, in his presence, I think the next natural question is how? Like, how is it that that actually practically works in my real life? If what you're saying is in the presence of Jesus, face to face is where I experience joy, how does that happen? How does that work in the scriptures? You know, I'm not a monk who just gets to sit on a mountaintop 7 days a week and meditate. Like, I have an actual real life. So how is it that this works? How do you get near to someone in the way that Cynthia worked her way through to get near to LeBron? How does that work with Jesus? Now, when you begin to look at and study the life of Jesus in the New Testament, you begin to see something that happens over and over and over again. It's people who want to get close to Jesus, and they do everything in their power to get near to him, believing, not sure what will happen, but believing that something good will happen, that they might get to experience that joy and that abundant life if they could just get into his presence. So, for example, there's a really short man named Zacchaeus who climbs a tree just to get a glimpse of Jesus because he thinks it might change his life. There's a blind man named Bartimaeus who screams as loud as he can from the side of the road because he wants to get himself into the presence of Jesus. There's a soldier, a commander who's not even a Jewish person who sends his troops to get the attention of Jesus because he's convinced if Jesus comes, things might be better. There's a group of friends who are so desperate to see their friend healed that while Jesus sits in a house and teaches, they literally dig a hole in the roof of someone's house, believing that if they can just get their friend into the presence of Jesus, good things might happen. So over and over, the story of the scriptures is that people do whatever it takes to get into the presence of Jesus, to be proximate to his presence because they think that something good could happen there. And what we see when we look at those stories is that a pattern emerges that answers the how. How is it if we're convinced that the most important thing of our life is to be in the presence of God and to have his face shine upon us? How is it that we actually do that? And today, that's what I want us to look at, the pattern of Scripture, and see if we can apply it to our own life, okay? So here is the text for today. Let me read it, and then we will start to go verse by verse through it. It's out of Mark chapter 5. A little bit of context. After Jesus crossed over by boat, a large crowd met him at the seaside. One of the meeting place leaders named Jairus came. When he saw Jesus, he fell to his knees beside himself as he begged, "My dear daughter is at death's door. Come and lay hands on her so she'll get well and live." Jesus went with him, the whole crowd tagging along, pushing and jostling him. Now, pushing and jostling, I want you to imagine how large this crowd must be. A woman who had suffered a condition of hemorrhaging for 12 years, a long succession of physicians had treated her and had treated her badly, taking all her money and leaving her worse off than before, had heard about Jesus. She slipped in from behind and touched his robe. She was thinking to herself, if I can just put a finger on his robe, I can get well. And the moment she did it, the flow of blood dried up. She could feel the change and knew her plague was over and done with. And at the same moment, Jesus felt energy discharging from him. He turned around to the crowd and said, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said, "What are you talking about? With this crowd pushing and jostling you, you're asking who touched me? Dozens have touched you." Don't you love it when the disciples rebuke Jesus? It's kind of a funny moment, happens over and over in Scripture. But he went on asking, looking around to see who had done it. The woman, knowing what had happened, knowing she was the one, stepped up in fear and trembling, knelt before him and gave him the whole story. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed. Be healed of your plague." This is really an incredible, incredible story. And what I want to look at is the journey of this woman to end in this place of blessing. How did this go for her? Because again, I think we're going to see a pattern emerge for our own lives about how to be in the presence of God. You see, her journey started with an invitation that came out of desperation. I mean, imagine her life. She had a physical problem. I mean, I couldn't imagine what it would be to bleed for 12 years, how uncomfortable that must have been, how life-changing that must have been just literally in her physical body, day in and day out. She had a financial problem. It tells us that she was now broke, that she had paid all of these so-called healers and she was broke. She had a social problem. Could you imagine how embarrassing this condition must have been? Because it impacted her every hour of every day, massively embarrassing. And then, of course, she had a spiritual problem because in Jewish terms, she was seen as unclean, and so she was not allowed to come to the temple. So not only was she outside of the people of God, but she believed that God's face was turned away from her, that God's favor was not on her because she could not come into his temple where his presence was. And so the biggest problem she had as a Jewish woman was a spiritual problem, that she was far from God and that God didn't seem to care about her. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you felt like nothing was working and everything was against you? Like maybe it made you feel helpless or hopeless? And here's what I want us to see in the beginning of the text today, because we don't often see this. When you're restless, when you're dissatisfied, when you're agitated, when you're frustrated, sometimes it might go as far as desperation. You're desperate to see something change. This is often, friends, an invitation from God. In the desperation, in the agitation, in the frustration is invitation. God allows this holy discontent to occur, to grab our attention, to begin to cause us to ask questions and to wonder about our life and to wonder, where is God in the middle of all that? Some of you right now came into this room today filled with holy discontent. Maybe you didn't describe it that way before you came in here, but now if you just dial into that one thing in your life, you're beginning to go, I am agitated, I am frustrated. Some of you are even saying, I am desperate for this thing to go differently. It could be maybe something with physical health. It could be a financial burden. It could be something is wrong with your kids. There's a relationship that's really broken. For some of you, I felt like the Spirit whispered to me this week and said, actually, there could be a few people in the room who, on the surface, there's nothing wrong with your life. Like if we were to look at your life from the outside, it's up and to the right. It's everything the American dream would sell you. And yet, in the middle of your life, you're discontent. You're agitated and you don't know why. It feels like something is just empty, like it's not fulfilled. And what I want us to begin to see as a people is that this is often invitation. Now, it's not always a promise that God's going to change the circumstance, although sometimes he does do that, but it's certainly an invitation to pay attention and to step closer to the proximity of the presence of Jesus to see what he would have to say about our own life and what he wants to do in that thing that is going on. And this woman clearly had hit her limit. And she was tired of her condition. It was desperation that led her to pay attention to an invitation from God. That then led her to what I would call calculation. The invitation led to calculation. It says in verses 27 and 28, she slipped in from behind and touched his robe. And this is key because she was thinking to herself, I can put a finger on his robe. If I can put a finger on his robe, I can get well. Like imagine this woman's life. Imagine, I have no idea where she's living, a little apartment probably. And she's doing the math in her life. And she's calculating like, how does this change? It's been 12 years. And the only thing we're told in the story is that she heard about Jesus. It doesn't sound like she had seen Jesus or that she knew Jesus. She had just heard about Jesus. But imagine how hopeless her life felt. For her, the one bet that she made in life was, I guess I need to get near that dude. That's the only place she had in her life. She's doing the calculation and she goes, I've tried everything else and I'm desperate. This is the one try I have left. It's the one bet that I can play. I think for all of us, we have moments where we do the math in our lives, don't we? Where we sit and we look at our life or we look at a set of circumstances in our life and we go, is this what I want? Is this what I imagine my life to be? Is this the direction that I want to go? Is this actually who I want to be and how I want to show up in the world? Or is this the status quo that I'm just fine with? And so I wonder for you right now, just to slow down, what are you calculating in your life right now? What's the math you're doing? And is there a place that maybe God is in that math for you, but you haven't seen it, where he's inviting you to step out of a place of stuckness and to step out of a place of status quo and to step into a place of risk where he might meet you? What is it that you're calculating right now? And if we're honest, oftentimes we'll do a calculation, and the truth is, the math equation leads us to go, I guess the status quo is okay, because it's going to take risk, and it's going to take energy, and it's going to take intentionality for this thing to change, and I just don't know that I'm ready to do that today. I have someone in my life who's very close to me, and she looked at her life a few months ago, and she just said, something's got to change, because she was using alcohol 5, 6, 7 days a week to manage her emotions and just the brokenness and some of the empty spaces in her life, some of the trauma from her past. And, she was waking up, hungover, and waking up not remembering the night before, and just, and she just woke up one day and she was doing the calculation, and she said, is this going to be me 5 years from now? Is this what it is? Like, if God would give me another 40 years, is this what my life is going to be? And she did the math on that, and she said, I don't want that to be the case. I don't want this to be the story that is said about me when I die. And so she has flipped her entire world upside down to go get treatment. And so her work schedule and her evening schedule and everything, because she just did the math and said, I'm tired of the status quo. I'm tired of being stuck. Something's got to change. I've got to reorient my entire life. And this is what this woman does. She makes a calculation that something has to change, that the status quo is not acceptable. And with that calculation, then, she steps into determination. I love this first line. She slipped in from behind and touched his robe. You see, the truth is, y'all, it's human nature, even though we all do the calculation, we all do the math in our lives, and sometimes we draw conclusions that we've got to go in a different direction. The truth is that in our humanness, we can mentally believe something to be true, but we never get into action around it. And this is where the quality and the characteristic of determination matter. She not only calculated, but then she determined, I'm going to get to the person of Jesus. Now imagine the obstacles that she faced to get to Jesus and why determination really mattered. There was a huge crowd. She was a woman. Most of the people in the town knew her condition and knew that she was socially and spiritually unclean and unacceptable. Jesus didn't know her, and Jesus hadn't invited her, and we can guess none of Jesus' friends had invited her. So she has all these obstacles to overcome to get into the presence of Jesus, and yet she has just decided and determined, I'm going to figure out how to get into his presence and see what happens. There must be a plan. There must be a lived out intentionality, or left to our own devices in our human nature, we always just fall back to the status quo. And so I wonder for you today, and maybe places where you're doing calculation or you did calculations and things in your life, I wonder where you might pause and the Spirit of God might whisper to you about you gave up on something too easily. I've been around churches a lot, and I've had this happen literally 100 times, where people say, I just feel like I've got to get into community. I've got to be around some like-minded followers of Jesus. I know that'll change things for me. I'm isolated, and I hear that, and then I go, cool, what did you do about that? And they're like, well, I went to this small group. I showed up at this group, and honestly, it was just kind of weird. And it wasn't my jam, and it wasn't my people. I'm like, cool, so then did you go to the next one? And they're like, no, I just never tried again. I'm like, oh, okay. That happens. I talk to people about like reading their Bibles or praying, or like maybe going away for a day. They're like, man, I tried it, but it was so hard. And being in solitude and silence, it made my skin crawl. I hated that. That's called detox, y'all. We have to detox. That's what that is. And I go, so I just never went back to it. I never did it. I said, oh, okay. I talk to people who are like, man, I'm being crushed by debt. I'm being crushed by debt. I go, oh, okay. Well, what have you done about that? They're like, I try to buy less Starbucks. I'm like, okay, like that's a good start. Like, have you ever thought about a budget? Have you ever thought about maybe doing the Dave Ramsey stuff, getting some buckets and some envelopes and starting to work your way? Nah, I haven't done that. You see, friends, in the scriptures over and over, God rewards the diligent. Those who stay at it, those who are determined, those who say, this is the direction of my life, this is where I'm going. And God, I hope that you're in the middle of that. I think this is what you're calling me to, and I'm going to be determined to chase after that thing. It's one of the lessons I think we take in the book of Genesis, where Jacob literally wrestles with God. And the story is that he won't let God go until God blesses him. It's one of the things that's celebrated about the life of Jacob, that he was determined above all others. Imagine wrestling with God. He said, I'm not letting you go until you bless me, until I get you. And God says, you have me. And he changed his name. Is there anything in your life that the Spirit would whisper to you about, hey, it's time to lean back into that. It's time to lean back in. It's time to give that another try. Hey, you and I both know you're not satisfied with the status quo. You and I both know that you're stuck. Hey, let's move. Let's get into action. Let's be determined. Let's build a plan. Let's go for it. And that's what this woman does. And it's really interesting as the story goes on, because she does it, and she touches Jesus, and she gets healed. She gets everything she wants. But then she comes to this moment that's really interesting, where Jesus is now looking for her, and she didn't expect this. She thought she was going to get in and get out, right? And she's like, no. It's always a personal exchange. It's not an economic exchange with him. He always wants to relate with you. He does want to give you things, but he wants your heart. And so he wants to have a face-to-face exchange with this woman. And so he's looking for her. And in verses 32 and 33, it says, but he went on asking, looking around to see who had done it. The woman, knowing what had happened, knowing she was the one, stepped up in fear and trembling, knelt before him, and gave him the whole story. You see, on its surface, what I'm talking about today may feel like a happy, clappy, like 5 steps to how to go to Barnes & Noble and get this and do it, and your life's going to be great. And what I want to make sure that I say today is that that's not the story of the Scriptures, that there's always the possibility of humiliation when we pursue God. There's possible humiliation. She comes fear and trembling. She had no idea that the crowd's eyes were going to be on her, and she had no idea. She had every right to believe that a male Jewish rabbi would rebuke her for touching him. That would have been the Jewish culture. And so she's in a moment of possible humiliation. And we see this happen all over the Scriptures. Those who pursue Jesus have to get over this fear of possible humiliation. We like to celebrate the disciples and what happened, but I've often had this thought. Those couple days where Jesus is in the tomb, have you thought a lot about how his disciples emotionally felt during that time? Like, I think obviously grief, shock, horror, sadness. They saw one of their closest friends, this guy they'd bet everything on, go to a cross, and now he's in a tomb. And I bet all of that emotion was there. But you know what other emotion I think had to have been there? The other thoughts that had to crept in? They had to start doing the math on their own future. They bet everything on this Jesus, and now he was gone. Can you imagine them going, how am I going to go back to my hometown with my friends? I even have a job? Could I go back to a job? Like, what are people going to say about me? I bet everything on Jesus, and now he's gone. Now this thing is over. What am I going to do? It's the possible humiliation. And so that's something as we go, hey, I want to get proximate to the presence of Jesus. We always have to be aware there's possible humiliation, because people can look at you and go, man, that's crazy that you took a day away to meet with God. What is that? That's weird. And it could be even crazier if you went away and you didn't feel like God spoke. And now you're sort of embarrassing yourself. You're like, God, I made this time and I didn't feel like you speak. Like, what do we do with that, right? Are we convinced that being in his presence is what matters? People go, man, why do you get up early to go do that karaoke and TED Talk thing? That's weird. That's not what this is, but that's what people think. That's strange. There's possible humiliation. Why is it that you're trying to get out of debt? Man, everybody lives with debt. Man, average credit card debt, $20,000 in America, big deal. Why are you not going out to dinner? Why are you taking less vacations? That seems weird. Well, because Jesus says that when I'm in debt, I'm a slave and that I can't be generous. And people go, that's weird, man. Why would you live like that? And so I think we have to be honest about the possible humiliation that can occur internally and externally. But I believe that this is the Christian life, that we have to fundamentally make a decision. Do we think that the King is worth it and that his promises are real? And that the most important thing about our life is if we can get ourselves in his presence, then the rest is details. It doesn't mean the rest is glorious. Doesn't mean it all gets taken care of, but the rest is literally details when we get proximate to the presence And of course, we end the story in this beautiful place. Jesus said to her, daughter, you took a risk of faith, and now you are healed and whole. Live well, live blessed, be healed of your plague. Can you imagine the joy that she experienced? 12 years she was stuck in status quo. 12 years, the joy she must have experienced, the shock she must have been in. I mean, I don't know that she would have had a lot of friends and family around her, so I just imagine her literally running through the streets, telling anyone who will listen what it is that Jesus has just done for her. She's experienced the abundant, joyful life that he promised. And what we find in Scripture, y'all, is those who choose to press in and to press through and place themselves in proximity to Jesus, here's the one thing about it, we never see that any of those people ever regretted it. They never regretted it. They never got to the end of their life and said, man, I wish I wouldn't have done that thing that was possibly humiliating. I wish I wouldn't have made the space to meet with Jesus. They never do that. They never regret it. It's quite the opposite because they're encountered by the living God and they see his joy and it leads to celebration and gratitude and awe for who Jesus is. They find that this God is not mad at them, but that he's smiling at them, that he's for them. Remember, a Jewish woman who would have felt that God's face was against her. And yet in this moment, he seeks her out and he blesses her and he heals her. And we get a picture of who God really is. And so there's no regret as they bet everything on being in the presence of Jesus. And I believe that this is one of the key marks of the Christian life, is that it's celebration and joy, even in the midst of sometimes circumstances that are hard, because people have chosen to bet on the person in the presence, and in that to receive the joy. And I'm praying for us that this becomes one of the main things that marks our community. That we become like this pattern that we see in Scripture. Okay, can you imagine us becoming a people who just says we're going to prioritize proximity to the presence of Jesus, believing as they found that overwhelming abundance of joy and the abundant life offered to us in him? Amen?